Hello everyone and welcome to my Ultra Nightmare guide for Doom Eternal, the Ancient Gods Part 1. Now, I've already done a video on the campaign for Ultra Nightmare, so if you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to watch that first because most of the advice is going to be there, while this is going to be more tailored for those specifically looking for DLC help. So I'll leave a link below that you can check that out. But yeah, let's just jump into it. So the way I kind of envision this video going is first I want to talk about weapons and how my opinions on some of them have changed over the course of this DLC. And then we're going to talk about just some general tips that I've picked up from the hours of practice that I've put in to beat Ultra Nightmare. And then we're going to go in and talk about specific fights in each of those levels, and then we'll end with some question and answer. Alright, so for those of you who watched my first video, you'll know that I had some pretty strong opinions about, like, the microwave beam. Now, when I saw the trailer for the Ancient Gods Part 1, I was like, oh, they're going to force me to use the microwave beam to take out the spirits. So, I did not want to use this weapon going in, but my opinion on it has totally changed. I completely love this weapon. I think the microwave beam is even better than the heat blast. By a long shot, too. I mean, you could be facing a tyrant, and you can just render him useless while you're frying him. And while you're doing that, it's really good to, like, throw grenades at the same time because it boosts the bar. But you can just render a big enemy useless. So if you have one enemy left over, you can just sit there and fry him and take away any risk of you dying. So I think it's great. It's probably what I'm going to be using now going forward instead of the heat blast. So that's completely flipped. That's the biggest change for me. The other big change that I would say is in my first video I talked about how I really just use the mobile turret. That's changed completely for me as well, and now I really just use the shield because it has saved my butt a ton. And I think the reason I said in my first video was I just wasn't very good at using it. Like, I would kind of hit the button twice by accident and then I have to wait for the recharge. I do think there are situations where the mobile turret will be useful, but for the most part I think the energy shield is the best. I will go ahead and say that there are other ones that I tried to use, like I tried to use the destroyer blade on the ballista, and I didn't really like that one a whole lot, and I really haven't put in a lot of time using it. I just don't like stuff that slows me down. For the most part with the ballista, I just use it just as regular fire. I don't really zoom in or anything. And then with the heavy cannon, the precision bolt is really what I use now. I don't think I used the micro missiles at all through the DLC, just because, you know, there's a lot of like precision important pieces in the DLC, so I think that's just best to just use. So these are the runes that I mainly use, you know, doing glory kills fast, doing a glory kill from far away, and then this is the one I think could be interchangeable, but I like this one because it gives you health. But as I thought about it more in preparation for this video, this one might be useful for like a boss fight, because the reason I never use it is like, oh, I can only use it once. And then I have a slot that I guess maybe I could switch it out. I don't know. I haven't messed around with it enough to really tell. But this one might be helpful for a boss fight, so maybe I should have used that. Maybe it would have made my life a little easier. But for the most part, this is what I use. When it comes to the rune that you decide to use for the DLC, my opinion on that is that the Desperate Punch is the best one. Now, I know a lot of people like the Concussive Blast, and I can understand why. And for the most part, I think that's a good one to use, but maybe not for Ultra Nightmare. And the reason for that is because I've seen this in myself and I've seen this in other streamers and other YouTubers, is when they get low health and they panic, they use their Blood Punch. So, you know, you want to have... So the one I'm talking about, Desperate Punch, doubles your Blood Punch damage when your health is below 75. Which I think is very helpful for when you panic. So that's my advice, and that's the one that I use. Again, I haven't really messed around with that other one, so if you disagree, I'll have to look at it a little bit more myself to kind of figure that out. In my previous video, I talk about the need to be using your flamethrower and your chainsaw, and I'm going to double down on that because you absolutely have to. It is important that you do not go into a glory kill or a chainsaw kill without flamethrowing an enemy first, if you have it available, because it is just free armor, and even if you don't need it in that moment, you might need it 2 seconds after that kill, and you'll be glad you did. And, you know, flamethrower is often best accompanied by a grenade or something like that, because it just yields a lot more armor. So I want to talk about the ice bomb for a little bit. I remember when Doom Eternal was being released, there was kind of like people complaining about the ice bomb and how they didn't really want it because it wasn't really like a hardcore weapon. The ice bomb will save your life a ton in Ultra Nightmare, and it makes really hard enemies really easy. A great example of this is the Doom Hunter, which you can make really easy to beat through using the Ice Bomb. So what you want to do is when a Doom Hunter appears, you hit him with the Ice Bomb, then you can double blood punch his sled, or do like one blood punch and then maybe 1 or 2 shots with a super shotgun, and that'll destroy the sled. And then he's easy, because I think his initial form is what is difficult. But it gets made easy by just using the Ice Bomb. So I think if you are playing the game and not using the Ice Bomb, you are making it harder for yourself. Plus the Ice Bomb is a great way to get health back, you know, because you can hit them with the Ice Bomb and then throw a grenade, flamethrower, and then you've got a ton of different resources that just show up. So there's a whole lot you can do with the Ice Bomb that makes things a lot easier for you. Alright, now we're on to kind of general tips and tricks. The best advice I can give you, which is the same advice I gave in my last video, is just to practice. And not just so you can learn enemy locations and when enemies spawn in, but because if you practice enough, you can develop a strategy that works best for you on how to take down waves of enemies. And it's best to figure out when to allocate certain resources, like a BFG shot, things like that. I guess now would be a good time to kind of talk about the BFG. You want to be very careful when you use your BFG, and as you do practice, you'll kind of figure out, oh, this is the good time that I should use the BFG. This is where I struggle the most, so this is when I should use it. For me personally, I tend to use the BFG against a bunch of medium-sized enemies versus just a couple of large enemies. I think it's easier to manage like 2 or 3 big enemies versus the 6 or 7 medium ones. So most of the time when I use the BFG, it's just to take out a lot of, smaller enemies or medium-sized enemies. And then I just kind of dance around the bigger ones and let them chase me and I shoot rockets at them. That's a lot easier strategy for me, because most of the time those BFG shots against the big ones will not kill them, versus if you do it against smaller enemies, it kills a bunch of them. Now here's an important thing about the BFG, is if you are in an arena where the arena gives you a BFG shot within the area that you're fighting, it probably wants you to use it, and I would encourage using it in that fight, because most likely those are the harder fights. But it is key that you take a BFG shot into the next level with you. So always have one when you end a level. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but the idea is you want to have 2 shots for the final boss. So the next piece of advice I can give you is to play dirty. Do not fight fair. So you should be looking at this codex and going, what are the weaknesses for each one of these? And using them every time you fight one of them. You should be switching weapons often. You should be using your Ice Bomb. You should be using all of your grenades all the time, using your flamethrower. Just overwhelming the enemy with things that are weak to them, that stumble them, that freeze them. Just be as aggressive as possible while also being defensive with your movement. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about level specifics, but there are 1 or 2 instances that you can bottleneck enemies. So that means you go into an area and it doesn't lock you out, and you can go back into like the previous hallway or somewhere and let the enemy come in and funnel into that tiny space. And then you can just hit them with maybe your shield turret or rockets. Just sometimes there's areas where you can bottleneck the enemy and it makes it a lot easier. You're already taking a risk as it is playing Ultra Nightmare, that, why not make it easier on yourself by fighting them one at a time instead of going out into a big area to do it. That isn't the case for a lot of the big fights, but for some of the small in-between stuff you can do that, so I'd encourage doing that. Another example that I noticed, and I'll talk about this specifically a little bit more, but in the first level, when you climb up to this area that's got an electrified ground, and it's got this kind of fence area over here with a soul sphere inside that little fence area, you can stay in that fence area and just hop up and shoot rockets at the enemy. So you can just play as dirty as you want and take out that whole little group of enemies without any damage to yourself. And you'll kind of see these as you practice the maps. You'll kind of see, oh, I can actually hang out in that first room and take out these enemies, or I can just stay here and it makes it hard for the enemies to get me. Or I can fight enemies from far away before jumping over to that next area. So there's lots of different ways you can approach a battle. Now this tip is pretty obvious, and both the developers and other people have said it quite a bit, that you do not want to stay still at all, that you're always wanting to be constantly moving so you're not in danger. And that's true. For the most part, there are 1 or 2 instances where it's okay to stay still for a second. I gave an example earlier where, maybe you're fighting one-on-one with a tyrant and you're microwaving him. You know, you could just stay there for a little bit, and then if the little enemies are coming at you, you can just throw an ice bomb, freeze them for a second, then go back to frying them, and that's okay. Just as long as you have control, just as long as you know for a fact you are safe, because you don't want to take the risk of something hitting you from the side, something you don't have control over. So only do it when you know for a fact you can get away with it. Alright, now we're going to go into level specifics, and I'll talk about certain fights that I had trouble with and how I can help you through some of those. For the most part, a lot of fights, I can just give you the general tips and you're going to have to practice for yourself to get good at them. But there are some that I can give you some specific advice for that'll help out a lot. So the first level is the UAC Atlantica, which I think is probably the coolest level. In my opinion, I love the environment. I think the enemy diversity is really good. I consider it to be one of the harder levels. I think the Blood Swamps is the easiest, then the UAC Atlantica, and then the Halt being the hardest one. So the first fight on the UAC Atlantica is right away. So there's kind of one big fight that's kind of split almost into two waves. One wave you fight at the beginning, then you go and you get the blue key card, and then you come back, and then you have kind of the second wave in that area. I think that kind of grouping of battles is really good for you to figure out where you are, where your skill level is at right now. I would encourage you almost when you do an Ultra Nightmare run, you should go through and just see how far you get just with one run, and then start practicing after there. Just see where you're at and then practice. So for the second battle, I'm actually going to show a clip of a good way to kind of begin it. This is an example of playing dirty. You can go up to the door, have it open, and you can take out the first eyeball turret, then turn and take out the second one. And then you can hop across, take out that one, the one that's kind of right there on the left, and then the one that's on the right. But this is an example of playing dirty because you can stand there with the door open and take out both those turrets without the fight starting. And then you can go into that battle, quickly take out the next two before there's really any big threats there. So that's an example of playing dirty, is you can just open the door and take out both of those turrets. So the next battle is where you go outside, you climb up, and then there's that electrified floor area with that fence with the soul sphere in it. You can do that fight a number of different ways. If you're really struggling with that one, you can kind of hide in that little fenced area and take out the enemies there. But the key with that fight is once you take out the enemies that are in that circle area, when you start going to, continue the level, two corpses will pop up. And you can take both of those out before you go a little bit further and an archvile shows up. So if you just don't rush it, you can take the enemies as they come. So you can take out the two, then take out him. And I think that's the best way to do it, because I think a lot of people will just go so fast that all those enemies show up at once and you have to fight 3 instead of 2 and then 1. But after that, there's not a whole lot more I can say before talking about the last fight. I know there's some other big fights in between there, but just going off of what I've already said, you should be okay for those fights. There's nothing more specific I can tell you. But we can just go ahead and talk about the last fight of the level. So I know that someone is going to ask me about the double Marauder, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer that right now. How do you deal with 2 Marauders? It's actually pretty easy, and I'll show another clip of me doing this. Is you want to get them next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. That way they are doing the same thing at the same time. So what I mean by that is they'll come at you, they'll both go to melee you, and then you shoot once and you hit both of them. And that way you can treat them as one enemy instead of you focusing on one and then you don't know where that other one is and then it kills you. That's the risk you run with Marauders, is because a Marauder is a very one-on-one experience. You need to be watching him. So it gets difficult when there's 2. So you want to get them together, treat them as one, then it's no problem. Then the rest of that fight, there's waves of enemies that get progressively harder, including Barons of Hell and then Tyrants. So maybe this is a good time to use one of the BFGs in a spot that you think is best for you after you've practiced and figure out where that timing is for you. Moving on to the Blood Swamps, there's really only one fight in that level that I consider to be kind of tricky. The rest of the level I consider to be pretty easy, the easiest of the 3. But I have some good tips and tricks for that one fight that I think will help. So the fight I'm talking about is the one where there's fog and a possessed arachnotron. So the way you want to start that encounter is you jump down to kind of where those Terminator zombie looking dudes are, and then you bring them back to that dry land, and then when they turn that corner you flamethrower and throw a grenade, gets you a ton of armor, and then you can really begin the fight. So once you take care of those Terminator looking guys by leading them back, you can go first right past the arachnotron, hop up like you're about to leave the area, and then land on that center stone platform area. It's a little tiny space, but you can land there, and then you can just shoot down at the possessed Arachnotron, and you can use the shield turret, you can throw rockets at it, and then you can use the microwave beam to take out the spirit. The microwave beam has a lot longer range than you think it does. After that, the rest of the fight you should be able to handle pretty easily, just given the other tips that I've given you. That's the hard part, is taking care of that possessed Arachnotron. But as far as the rest of the fights in the Blood Swamps, I don't consider them to be very hard. You just have to use the advice that I've given you, practice them until you're good at them. I don't even think the floating squares with the eyeballs on them is even that hard. I think that's the easiest part of the level, actually. But you should be able to handle those fights okay. But it's important that you bring a BFG round into the next level. It's critical that you do. So if you can bring 2, even better, but you have to bring 1 at least. Alright, the Halt. This level was very hard for me. It was the absolute bane of doing this Ultra Nightmare run. I died there probably the most out of all the other levels combined. The fights are hard, and they can cluster around you, and it can be very difficult. You can get stuck. You know, you might just have bad luck and something bad happens. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. During the run that I actually beat Ultra Nightmare, I used that first BFG round in that first battle, but I kind of panicked and used it, because at the very end of that first battle, you fight a Tyrant and a Marauder at the same time, and I just kind of panicked and I wanted it to be done so fast, so I hit the Tyrant with the BFG round, and then I proceeded to kill the Tyrant and then the Marauder. And as I finished off the Marauder, I was like, maybe I really didn't need to use that BFG round, but I might have even wanted to use it earlier, because I've died earlier in that fight multiple times. The big decision when you're doing that level is when you want to use those BFG rounds, because you want 2 for the final battle, and you're going to use 1 in the second battle. And now it's just a toss-up of whether or not you're going to use that BFG round in the first battle, or you're going to use it in the third battle, which is against 2 Tyrants, a Doom Hunter, and one of those Tyrants is possessed. So just briefly, like I said, the second battle involves a lot of Barons of Hell. There's a lot of enemies, and it gives you one of the BFG rounds right away. And I would encourage you to use that in a spot that fits best for you. I like to use it pretty early and then manage the Barons of Hell just on my own, but that's up to you. The hardest part of Ultra Nightmare is the final boss. And the reason for that is you can do everything perfectly and still get screwed over by bad luck. So with his first phase, it's not hard. It's pretty easy, actually. You just need to hit him, and the best weapons, I think, for fighting him would be the Ballista, or maybe the heavy cannon, scope shot. I wouldn't use rockets, because since he teleports, it makes it hard to hit him, but you should be getting headshots with the weapons that you use. So the second phase of the battle is where he has a possessed Mancubus, and then he has a possessed Hell Knight. The best way to deal with those guys is to take out the Hell Knight first, probably using rockets. That's the easiest way to do it. The reason for that is you don't want to be trying to microwave beam a spirit while you got a really fast Hell Knight coming at you. So take out the Hell Knight first, and you can use the Mancubus' still pretty slow walking speed to your advantage, and just take out the Hell Knight and then the Spirit, and then deal with the Mancubus. So after you do that, you kind of have this middle phase where you're not fighting Sam directly in any way, you're just kind of surviving the area. So the best way to deal with this intermedial third phase is to just stall for time the best that you can. Just try to survive for a minute, because it'll go immediately into the fourth phase. So just take out the Cacodemons at a rate you think is good, because you don't want them to swarm you. You can kind of play with that first one a little bit before killing them, just to stall for time, but just focus on surviving and not, falling into the electricity or anything. The fourth phase. This is where I probably died the most, and I think is the hardest phase, even harder than the next phase that's after this one. And the reason being is because there is so many things that can kill you that it makes it hard to focus on one single objective. The things that'll kill you the most during this phase are area of effect attacks. So that means that Sam teleported on top of you and does his area of effect attack, or you're on a platform for too long and the Bloodmaker hops up and does his area of effect attack and kills you, or you miss one of the platforms, you fall on top of one of the electrifying eyeballs, and then you get fried. You don't want to spend a lot of time in this phase, because the chances of something bad happening, either chance or you messing up, increase. So my tip for the fourth phase is to stay on top of those 4 platforms. There's 2 that are tall, and then there's another 2 that are almost as tall, and then there's 4 in the corners. You want to stay on those top 4 as long as possible. The only reason to go below is to get ammo, and then you're out of there as fast as you can, because you're going to get hit by those eyeballs, and it's going to be a bad time. You're just losing health for no reason. Now, I wouldn't really bother with the Bloodmaker. You can, if the opportunity presents itself and it's like handed to you to kill him, then do it. But I wouldn't recommend doing it. I would just kind of lead him around and let him chase you, because they just respawn. There's not really a point to it. And the big reason why you don't want to deal with him is just because you want to get this phase done as fast as possible. That way you can get away from the hardest one and into the next one, which is probably the second hardest one. But it's the one you've been preparing for. So the last phase involves a possessed Pain Elemental and a possessed Dread Knight. Now it's okay because you've been preparing for this throughout the entire DLC, being careful with those BFG resources. As soon as the fight begins, you point your BFG directly at the Dread Knight and you shoot him twice with it. You take both those shots directly at him and then immediately switch to your rocket launcher, which you will do a triple burst on him, and it should kill him. And if you're lucky, he's kind of on the edge of that corner platform, which will allow you to hop down in between the pillars, let them be your cover while you microwave beam the spirit. And this is one of those moments where it's okay to stand still, because you should have enough time before anything gets to you to take care of that first spirit. And as soon as that first spirit's gone, you're out of there. Once you get rid of that first spirit, you should be okay to take care of the Pain Elemental. Just use your shield turret, rocket launcher, or ballista to just make quick work of them, and then fry the spirit, and then you're done. You have beat Ultra Nightmare, and you get a shiny new gold skin to show off to your friends and your enemies in battle mode. Alright, now that I've gone through my list of things that I can help you with, let's see what stuff you need help with. Question number 1. Which way should I go in the Blood Swamps? Now that's a good question, and it doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. I've done both ways, going left or right. It just depends on what you consider to be hardest. I would do the harder thing first, instead of spending time going through the easier one for you, beating it, and then dying to the one that you find more difficult. For me, I tend to go left because I considered the Possessed Arachnotron to be harder, so I want to take care of that first, but I've done both, and it didn't make a huge difference to me. The second question you guys asked me is, should I do the optional fights? No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't do any of the optional fights. I think I talked about this in my original guide for the campaign on Ultra Nightmare, and it still applies to the DLC. You shouldn't do the optional fights. The only reason, so you don't want to do any of the secret encounters because they don't give you any reward, it's just risk for no reason. The Slayer Gates will give you a rune, but it's not worth it, in my opinion. Because the Blood Swamps will give you a rune without having to do a fight, so just go through the first level without getting a rune, and then get it in the second level. Good question, though. Which is harder, the campaign or the DLC? That's also a good question. I think they're difficult for different reasons. I think the campaign could be more frustrating, because there's a lot more video game that you have to go back through when you lose. And the DLC's like high risk, high reward. But I do consider the DLC to be harder in terms of the enemies that you fight, the way that they're presented, and just, bad luck that can happen. Is it worth it? That's kind of a personal question, I think. For me, it's worth it because I get to produce this content for you guys. But for you guys, that's up to you whether you think it's worth it or not, because it takes time to practice the levels to get good enough to beat them on Ultra Nightmare. It's just all up to you if you think it's worth putting in the time to practice. For me, I think it's worth it because I love having the gold skin. I'm always incentivized by rewards, so giving me a unique skin for beating it, that's reason enough for me to go through it, so I think it's worth it. That's really all I have for you guys. I want you guys to leave comments down below on either questions that you have or tips that you have discovered for yourself that you want to share with other people. Help each other out in the comments. I want to see what you guys think, if you disagree with anything, or extra help that you want to add as well. But yeah, that's really it for me, guys. I'll see you guys in the next one.